Well, it's a great joy to be with everybody today and to talk a little bit about this fascinating character in William O'Higgins. First, I thought that I would give a little bit of an explanation to the title of the talk. You know that when it comes to the Civil War, like so many other wars, there were many people who tried to escape from war, whether that was to be escaping from wars encroach, quite literally, into their own backyards, or escaping their own involvement, their own participation in it. But Father O'Higgins is kind of a rare example of someone who really wanted to escape to the war. He was very, very motivated, you might say, to move in this direction, and considered his participation in the war to be a way to escape some pastoral duties which had gone less than well, but more about that in a little bit. So Father O'Higgins, a Cincinnati priest who was chaplain to the 10th Ohio. Now I suspect that before today's talk, almost none of you had ever heard of William O'Higgins. There's a couple notations about him either in Soldiers of the Cross or in a few other books that have been written on the Civil War and the Catholic Church. But really he's a very minor figure, at least in these histories. But I'm really convinced that his own story is one that has a certain way of being a lens for us to understand the 19th century in a better way. So he was an immigrant, as so many people were at this time. He was a member of an ethnic minority, Irishman. He was a missionary and a pastor, and he was also a soldier and a fighter. And we can think of fighter literally or maybe figuratively in some ways. He had a lot of energy that he put forward. We'll hear more about that in a moment. So I was once giving a very, very brief overview of Father O'Higgins' life to a priest friend, and the friend over the phone, he exclaimed this. He said, "Well, he's like a 19th century Forrest Gump." And it's true. His life skirted some of the most important and impactful moments of the 19th century. So this includes when he was in Ireland, the Irish famine. This includes, obviously, the U.S. Civil War. It includes post-war Reconstruction. And then, of interest to Catholic historians, a little bit of a rubbing shoulders with one of the most important bishops at the First Vatican Council. So he had a very, very interesting life that ends exactly where it began, in Ireland. So he goes full circle. So when we think about all these episodes of his life, though, the one that I think, when he looked back over his life, that he found to be most significant was definitely his 3 years of service to the 10th Ohio as chaplain. He was a man who tried many, many things, but never exactly found a good fit, with the exception probably of his chaplaincy to the 10th. So it was here that he was certainly most at home. He was a man who could bristle under authority. We'll find lots of examples of that today. He could be certainly disagreeable. He could be mean-spirited. He could be jealous of others. But this war, as the title suggests, was at least one of the means by which he was able to claim a good deal of self-respect, acceptance, one could even say, in kind of not quite theological terms, redemption, and that of his comrades. We'll talk a lot about that today as well. So it's one thing to kind of do a kind of biographical account, which we will do, but it's another thing to kind of situate that within the soldiers of the 10th. So I'll try to do that as well today. So quite a bit on O'Higgins, but then also quite a bit on the 10th itself. So first, a little bit on O'Higgins the man. So Father O'Higgins, the future Father O'Higgins, was born in 1829 in Ireland, but he had a very famous uncle, an uncle by the name of William O'Higgins, so same as he. And this William O'Higgins, the bishop, was actually the bishop of Ardagh, in Ireland. And with his uncle's support or prompting, we don't exactly know, he began studying for the priesthood at Maynooth. Maynooth is still today, it's one of the most significant seminaries, especially in the 19th century. At that time, it was thought to have been the largest Catholic seminary in the world. So think about this place bustling with Irish young men who were testing their call to priesthood, if you will. So the young William, at his uncle's prompting, enters Maynooth, and at first it seems to be going okay until the bishop dies, Bishop O'Higgins. And then all of a sudden, without the kind of backing and the patronage that the soon Father O'Higgins was enjoying at the time, the rector of the seminary starts to wonder if it might be better if the young O'Higgins was gone. So after the death of the uncle in 1853, we find the rector kind of pushing O'Higgins out the door. But O'Higgins himself finds his own way out when a traveling missionary bishop comes to town, a man by the name of John Hines, who was bishop to British Guiana, so an area in the kind of the northeastern part of South America, so much so that it's kind of seen as part of the West Indies. So you have O'Higgins here at Maynooth when Bishop Hines comes to town recruiting Irish seminarians to become missionaries. During this time, Hines actually interviews the rector, the head of the Maynooth Seminary. And this is what Hines has to say about that interview. Quote, "After all that was said against O'Higgins, his violence of temper, his insolence, his cunning, I consented to have him anyway, for he can hardly be as bad as the priests I already have." That actually would prove true. Almost to a man, the other clergy were problematic. And later on, Hines actually says something along the lines of, Higgins is the only one who has proven to be worth anything at all. So his missionary life in British Guiana was quite difficult. You can imagine illness, very, very rampant. You can imagine the poverty, the church just starting in this locality. And it's actually Hines himself who looks for a way out. And he complains enough to the Vatican that the Vatican decides to put the entire missionary endeavor under the Jesuits. And so the Jesuits come on board, Hines gets to leave, and O'Higgins is more or less told, you can choose your next move. Do what you will. And it's at this point that he writes a letter to Archbishop John Purcell of Cincinnati. Archbishop Purcell, one of the most significant 19th century churchmen. He actually was bishop for 50 years in Cincinnati, which is really unbelievable, 1833 to 1883. And he built our still existing, still standing St. Peter in Chains Cathedral early in his episcopacy. So O'Higgins reaches out to Purcell and basically says, is there a spot for me? Can you provide me, anything in Cincinnati? And certainly Purcell responds very, very quickly that he is willing to do this. So on May the 29th, 1857, O'Higgins goes to the post office and he opens a letter from Purcell saying, get here as soon as you want, we'll have something for you to do. Now keep in mind, and this is going to be important for our understanding of the Civil War in a little bit, but keep in mind that there had been a huge increase in Irish immigration over the prior decade or so, prior to 1857. And so you have a large number of Irish, but not necessarily a large number of Irish priests that are able to minister to them. And so O'Higgins is very much someone that is going to be put to work in the parishes basically along the Ohio River in the southern part of Ohio, not just Cincinnati, but also upriver as well. So after a couple years of being at a couple small little parishes, which probably had no more than maybe 50 or 100 Irishmen in them, he gets kind of promoted to the big leagues. He is sent as the assistant priest, so kind of second in command, at the largest Irish parish in Cincinnati, St. Patrick's. Now, the pastor at the time is a man by the name of Father Richard Gilmore. He's going to be important actually towards the end of O'Higgins' life. So remember that name, Father Richard Gilmore. Father Richard Gilmore was of staunch Presbyterian parents. And he had actually grown up in, the family went to Nova Scotia first and then down to Pennsylvania. And it's at that point, it seems, that he converts to the Catholic Church and then enters a seminary to begin studies for the priesthood. For reasons that are not entirely clear, we know that Gilmore and O'Higgins clash pretty much immediately. They do not get along at all. Maybe it's because Gilmore had this kind of Scottish Presbyterian background that O'Higgins may have found difficult or offensive. Maybe it's just that they had very, very different personalities. We don't know for sure. But again, remember Father Gilmore and St. Patrick's Church. We do know that the dispute between the two was significant enough for O'Higgins to think that he was actually going to be removed from the diocese by Archbishop Purcell. And so we have this kind of paper trail that unfortunately is only one-sided. So if you go to the archives of the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, you will find these letters that O'Higgins sent to Purcell. What doesn't survive is any outgoing correspondence that would have gone to O'Higgins. But this is what we do know. April 17th, 1861, 5 days after Fort Sumter, exactly. We have this letter from O'Higgins to Purcell, which at least gives his side of the dispute with Father Gilmore. Their most immediate dispute that's related in this letter seems to involve the fact that O'Higgins had failed to show up to hear confessions at a time he was assigned to do so. O'Higgins wrote, quote, "I feel the agony of dissolution when I consider that you find it necessary to fling me off as a vile and worthless thing." O'Higgins then explains, "I did not go to the confessional because I saw an indication on the part of the people to come more to me than to the pastor, and I did not want to encourage such a thing." So it's a nice way of saying, I was so popular there at the parish, the pastor was so hated, I just didn't want to encourage any of that. I know nothing like that ever goes on today. So he ends his letter to Purcell by saying, "I beg of you to withdraw your expulsion and believe my sincere sorrow. I do not know what I write because of my great agitation. Your obedient servant, Father William O'Higgins." Now again, we don't know what Purcell said in response to this, but we do know that O'Higgins wrote again just almost exactly a month later. Now between the middle of April and the middle of May, what had transpired? Well, in a way, things had become obviously more heated. They're preparing more and more for war. No major battle had really yet been fought at this point, but everything is being organized, right, for this great conflict. So O'Higgins writes this: "Many persons have told me that I ought to apply for the situation of chaplain to the army, and this according so well with my own inclinations. I would have gone personally and solicited this for you, or for it, but for the shamefacedness which so long has kept me from the cathedral." So he's basically saying, I would have come in person to ask you to be chaplain, except I was petrified to think how you might respond. I am doing no good here, referring to St. Patrick's, nor am I likely to do any good, however strong my desire might be. My life is unutterable misery. I have not slept 2 consecutive hours for a month's time. Time innumerable I have left my room with the intention of approaching you, and always when I was just about to enter your house, my heart failed me. Do give me one more chance of redeeming my character and feeling that I am not a pariah, a reprobate. I am anxious not only to do good, but to repair all past negligences. I appreciate fully the serious obligation of a chaplain to the American Army, and I trust in God I shall not be wanting in my efforts to meet them. So this is his letter of escape, his attempt to escape ministry in Cincinnati. So Archbishop does agree to his request. And on June the 3rd of 1861, O'Higgins becomes chaplain of the 10th Ohio, which was just then being organized in Cincinnati, primarily an Irish regiment, as we will see. So this was not just an attempt to allow O'Higgins to do what he wanted to do and to escape Father Gilmore and the situation at St. Patrick's. It was also a very, very real need within the Army, a very real need within the church in terms of ministry to these young soldiers. O'Higgins was one of the very few Catholic chaplains who served during the war. The estimate is probably something like 40 or so priest chaplains in the Army, in the Union chaplains in the Army, and many of them did not serve at the same time. So there are some that served for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. O'Higgins was one of the few that actually served for the vast majority of the war, 3 years' time. Most of the others did not serve that kind of length. So to think about, for the Union soldiers, which would have numbered something like 200,000 Catholics, this is kind of a questioned number and a disputed number in some ways, but maybe 200,000 Catholic soldiers who would have had at best one priest for every 5,000 of them. So you can think about the needs of soldiers for Mass and reception of communion, the needs of soldiers for confession in particular, last rites, and to think how war would have just exacerbated that need. And yet there are not anything close to enough priest chaplains to answer the great need. So there were some Catholics, even Northerners, who did not approve of the war effort at all. They were sympathetic to the Confederate cause. But a couple folks in Cincinnati, including Purcell and his auxiliary bishop, Bishop Rosecrans, were very, very strongly Union. And this was important. This is why, as was said by Father Bob, that there were 2 Cincinnati priests who were chosen or allowed to become chaplains. So the very first assistant bishop to Purcell was the man here on the right, Bishop Sylvester Rosecrans, who was the younger brother of Union General William S. Rosecrans. So it was kind of a family connection, right, here. So they had this enthusiasm that helped them to become certainly very supportive of the Union and supportive of priests entering the chaplaincy on behalf of the Union. So an editorial in the Catholic Telegraph, which is the Cincinnati Catholic newspaper, edited by the bishop's brother and the general's brother, so edited by Father Edward Purcell, Archbishop's brother, and Bishop Rosecrans, the general's brother. They called for more Catholic chaplains. Quote, "We have not a sufficient number to supply our destitute congregations, much less for the very arduous department of ministry," referring to the Army. "But we think it would be good if priests were willing, and when judged fit by their bishops, to devote their energies to preparing Catholic soldiers to appear before their God." So a very strong sense that even though priests were in very short supply everywhere, there were not enough for the congregations that existed, it was still a very worthwhile, indeed, absolutely essential thing to help these young Catholic soldiers who would be in harm's way. Many would die, many would be injured, and to have priests available to them was seen as essential. So when the 10th Ohio was formed, this was an obvious opportunity for O'Higgins. This was not exclusively Irish, but as you can see by one of the battle flags with the Maid of Erin harp on it, there were lots and lots of Irish who were part of this, including, depending on how you want to count him, the regimental leadership included William Haynes Lytle. Maybe some of you know of Lytle. He was a veteran of the Mexican War. He was then commander of the regiment, and he was not Catholic, but he was said to have been of Irish extraction, probably more like Scots-Irish kind of thing, and Episcopalian maybe in terms of religiosity. But Lytle and O'Higgins got along very, very well, and Lytle in no way stood kind of between, if you will, O'Higgins and his Catholic troops. So O'Higgins' duties to the 10th included the things you would imagine, saying Mass, hearing confessions, preaching, offering exhortation of various kinds, and preparing men for the sacraments. We might not think of it, but actually, war was a great time to get caught up on your sacraments. So if people hadn't been baptized, an opportunity. If they had never made First Communion or Confirmation, opportunity. So he was doing this. One of the things, just as kind of a little bit of an aside, but the way that Catholics were able to keep their faith alive was often through private devotions of various kinds. So it's not unusual, of course, for soldiers to carry into war little mini prayer books, very, very small, usually. Possibly a rosary, possibly some kind of a pocket shrine, as is illustrated there on the right, that may have had a little statue of the Blessed Mother or another patron saint. So these were ways that the Catholics were able to express their faith. They were also able to do so, of course, through participation at Mass when that was possible. Now, this is not O'Higgins, but this is an example of a camp Mass. This is actually Father Mooney of the 69th New York. This is probably the most famous Catholic-related, chaplain-related photograph from the Civil War. It's just stunning, in some ways, in terms of the quality of the image, and you can clearly tell what the priest was going to do. So O'Higgins would have tried to say Mass on a daily basis when he could, but one of the difficulties was not always having the supplies that he needed. So one of the letters that he writes back to Archbishop Purcell, quote, "I have had Mass every day since I last saw you, and this very hour I received a gift that the general had forgotten that he had, which was 6 bottles of wine. I could carry no more with me even if I had more. And just then I was thinking that I could not find any more juice of the grape." So basically saying, I needed this wine for Mass. I didn't think I was going to be able to find any, and now I have this great gift. So this was a challenge for O'Higgins. What was more challenging, however, though, was his attempt, as so many chaplains did, to elevate the morale of the men. You know that young men, military men, don't necessarily have the reputation of being virtuous, right? And so O'Higgins tried to call them to greater virtue. But this was not easy because the men of the 10th in particular gained a reputation, if you will. They were known for being heavy drinkers. Even before they left Cincinnati during their training, there was some brawling with some German soldiers, which seemed to be encouraged by libations. And while on furlough in Cincinnati, this is a little bit later, only 1/3 of the 10th showed up when they needed to depart for Louisville, Kentucky. So one historian claimed that they had to be gathered up from bars, brothels, and jails in order to leave Cincinnati. And the official record noted that with great annoyance and delay, the regiment was reassembled. Another report said their absence was attributed to their great sorrow at leaving friends and relatives and the need to drown that sorrow in a favorite libation. So this behavior was very typical, unfortunately, of the 10th Ohio. There's a story that they raided a hospital tent one night to take the whiskey, which was being used as a form of anesthetic, and they actually tied up the tent steward in order to get off with the alcohol. The next morning, after this stealing of a large quantity of whiskey, one of the gentlemen whose diaries we have actually from the 10th Ohio, a man who I think I reference later. I believe it's, I think it's Daniel Finn, if I remember right. This is what he said. The 10th is in open revolt today. It refuses to march forward unless it can have the front, which does not belong to it today. Half of the men are drunk and the other half are crazed. The general threatened to fire on the soldiers, actually to make them move forward, but did not do that. Eventually, quote, a slow, noisy, boisterous mob advanced. So there's no indication that O'Higgins was the type that wanted the men to completely pledge not to ever drink any alcohol. There were priest chaplains that did this, and there were certainly Protestant chaplains that did as well. But O'Higgins does not seem to have been one of them. There's even some stories of him bringing libations for St. Patrick's Day or other special occasions for them. But there's also no evidence that O'Higgins tolerated, and basically, would have been looking the other way when it came to immorality. Here's a quote that gives us some sense of this. This is probably my favorite quote in all of the correspondence between O'Higgins and Purcell. Quote, nearly all of my boys have made their Easter. Making their Easter refers to receiving confession and then communion during the Easter season. A few scoundrels will growl and scold if I be absent 1 hour in time of danger, and when they get sick, cry lustily for the priest, but they are still in league with sin. I have given them every opportunity to live like Catholics, and it grieves and perplexes me to find how low and wicked they continue to be. If they had no chaplain, those mean fellows would go many miles to find a priest and receive the sacraments. Now they believe that they may live with the devil, and that it is my duty to risk my life to save them from his clutches at the hour of death. It were almost an injustice to do so. I love that line. So we do know that camp life would have put Purcell in a little bit of a quandary. He needs to maintain the esteem of the men, their affection, their respect, but also in no way, consider their actions to be okay, to be ratified in a way. So we do know this about the 10th. So despite the hard drinking, kind of reputation, they were known as being very valiant, being very fearless, and they actually get the nickname the Bloody Tenth, or the Bloody Tenth. And this occurs because of their engagement in two very important battles fairly early in the war. The first being Carnifex Ferry, present-day West Virginia, and Perryville, Kentucky. They were engaged in both of those battles. And so the regiment would have originally had about 1,000 strong, and it fell to about 500 by the time of Perryville. Now this would have been a combination of defection, death, disability, et cetera, not just all killed in action kind of thing. And so the first of these significant battles is fought there as part of the West Virginia campaign in kind of the early part of the war, July to September of 1861, when the overall troops who had assembled for that campaign were under the guidance, under the command of Generals McClellan and Rosecrans. So it is true that the Bishop of Cincinnati, one of the bishops of Cincinnati's brothers, was directly, in a sense, in connection with the 10th and with O'Higgins. So O'Higgins' bravery was lauded at the Battle of Carnifex Ferry. One account reported that he was constantly with his men. He courageously crawled between the lines amid enemy fire to bring water from a spring to help soothe their parched throats. The Catholic Telegraph said this: "In the din and tumult of the battle, there he stood, fearing not death, nor coveting a martyr's grave, bending over the wounded and administering the last rites of the church." So he was one that was known to be very much in the middle of things, to be sure. And this only changes, as we'll see in a moment, when the 10th is kind of pulled back from the heaviest fighting. So 2 months later, on the way to Kentucky, the 10th stops in Cincinnati for a few days, and they are welcomed back into the city as the heroes of Carnifex. They arrived at the city's public landing and paraded to Lytle's home. Lytle had actually been injured previously, and so he was home at the time, convalescing, but both he and O'Higgins kind of rode forward next to each other in the parade car, if you will, kind of symbolically assuming command of the 10th together. So we have this kind of positive regard for them in the midst of the early part of the war. Now we turn to Perryville. Oh, here's Carnifex. So it's at Perryville that the 10th has significant losses. More than 40% were killed or wounded. One eyewitness said this, quote, "I could have walked on bodies without touching the ground for several hundred yards," if you can imagine. So after Perryville, the 10th is removed from the heaviest fighting, from the thick of the action. And O'Higgins is kind of complaining about this to Purcell. He writes, quote, "Our life has become one round of marching and counter-marching, but we are still comfortable with the feeling that God may be saving us from the hardship of our comrades further in front." So in a way he's grateful, but in a way he's bored, as I suspect the men were as well. One of the soldiers, Alfred Purcell from Company F of the 10th Ohio, he's another one that we have a surviving journal from. He was describing O'Higgins this way: "He is a highly educated and traveled gentleman, but guileless as a child. He's a fine sociable companion and tells many remarkable tales. He has 2 horses, and when we are encamped near a town, he spends a great deal of time among the inhabitants, finding many interesting and amusing items that he picks up. He is a genius, and I hope that he will always have as many friends as he now has in the 10th. There's a comical incident that he tells about O'Higgins, and it involves O'Higgins kind of going wherever he wanted, which apparently he did a lot on his horses, and he actually finds himself over the lines, and he gets fired on first by the Confederates, and then when he tries to get back behind the Union lines, they begin to fire on him as well, and eventually, apparently, they seize him, they capture him, and tell everyone that they have found a long-haired rebel spy. Of course, it was O'Higgins, and when they found out his true identity, they got a lot of amusement out of it and called it O'Higgins' charge. So they enjoyed that. So the one group, he was very respected among the soldiers, no doubt at all, but the one group that O'Higgins did not get along with were basically the other priests. Hard to imagine. No, it's not actually. So O'Higgins' letters to Purcell talk a lot about the distasteful aspect of having to minister in the same locality as some of these priests. And the one that he disliked the most was Father Jeremiah Tracy, the personal chaplain to General Rosecrans. So you see some potential conflict here. Father Tracy and O'Higgins were definitely both vying for the general's favor, placing Tracy as this kind of potential enemy. O'Higgins wrote this to Purcell. While Tracy was about headquarters, I had no position at all. He would send down an order or what he thought was an order for our regiment to go to his chapel just as I was commencing Mass. Since he doesn't have his own congregation, the next best thing would be to try to take mine. So you get a sense of the competition. Now, a very significant blow to O'Higgins and the 10th occurs with the death of General Lytle. Lytle had been wounded at Carnifex. He had had a more minor kind of thing at Perryville, and he did recover. But he would not recover from the wounds that he suffered at the Battle of Chickamauga. So shortly before his death, the men of the 10th actually gifted him with this Celtic-inspired cross, you might call it, with the emerald in the middle signifying Ireland. The Confederates hastily had buried Lytle, but the men of the 10th came to claim his body. And as soon as they claimed his body, they had a requiem mass of sorts with O'Higgins presiding. You might call it a memorial mass, though Lytle was not a Catholic. So just before Lytle's death, O'Higgins' own health had become very, very precarious as well. And he was, quote, in a feeble state confined to his bed. And he did get a medical leave of absence for about 20 days, which was an attempt to get his health back. We don't have very many letters or many references to his chaplaincy after this point. Maybe some things were lost because there are no letters that talk about the death of Lytle, for instance, from O'Higgins' hand or anything like that. But we do know that there is one surviving letter from November of 1863 that shows he is still with the regiment, he is still active in his ministry. So here at the end of the war, O'Higgins, with 300 or so members of the 10th Ohio, musters out June 17, 1864. As one chronicler said of them, the ranks of the 10th were thinned, its banners were blood-stained and torn, and the 1,000 brave hearts that beat the day they pledged their lives for the protection of their colors, very few remained to tell of Lytle and the 10th. So in some ways, you might think, well, the story could stop here, right? We've reached the end of the war. O'Higgins seems to be done. But there's a nice kind of interesting epilogue to O'Higgins' life, what occurs after the war. So after the completion of his service, we think, well, Purcell's opinion must have changed, or at least must have been elevated somewhat, because he allows O'Higgins back into the diocese. Notwithstanding a bad report about him that occurred right at the wars, I guess right when the war ended, right after his discharge, when Bishop Spalding of Louisville claims that he found O'Higgins, or the report that O'Higgins was attending the theater one night with a fellow priest, which apparently was considered to be an improper thing for clergy to do. But Purcell lets him back in the diocese anyway. So he assigns him as pastor of a small mission parish on the west side of Cincinnati, but that lasts for less than 1 year. Then he's chaplain to the Sisters of Mercy, but that lasts for 1 year. And finally, for unknown reasons, O'Higgins goes to, at least at this time in the history, a God-forsaken place, Little Rock, Arkansas. Little Rock, Arkansas is a place with very, very few Catholics, but they do have an Irish bishop, Edward Fitzgerald, who at one time had ministered in the Diocese of Cincinnati, and that's probably how O'Higgins knew him. So he lives with Fitzgerald in St. Andrew's Cathedral Rectory in Little Rock and ministers for a short time. A little footnote in history here for you. So from 1869 to 1870, the First Vatican Council occurred in Rome, and all the bishops of the church gathered together. And the council was cut short by war, but before it could conclude, they did vote on a document, a proclamation on papal infallibility, approving this idea, this theological idea of papal infallibility. Interestingly enough, even though most of the Italian, Spanish, etc., thought infallibility was a great idea, well supported in Scripture and tradition, a lot of the American bishops did not. And so many of the bishops simply came home without voting. They didn't want to embarrass the Pope. They wanted to get out of town. Purcell gets out of town. There's a lot of Americans that do. But Fitzgerald stays around long enough to vote the equivalent of no, or this doesn't please me. Non placet is the technical vote. And there is only one other bishop in the entire world, an Italian, who votes no. So Fitzgerald, after the vote, then does say, I basically provides his obedience to the Holy Father, and so there's no lasting strain there. But this particular incident has been called Petricula contra Petrum, which is basically Latin for the big rock versus the little rock. So referring to Cherub Peter, Rome, the papacy, the rock on which the church was built, and then Bishop of Little Rock, Arkansas. But again, for unknown reasons, soon after welcoming back Fitzgerald, O'Higgins actually gives this great kind of laudatory speech, which is printed in the newspapers down there, saying that Fitzgerald is, among the best of bishops and has turned down many, many appointments, et cetera, et cetera. But shortly after this address, he leaves. And next, he finds himself in Cleveland, Ohio, where he becomes professor of philosophy at St. Mary's Seminary. He teaches one term. Then he becomes pastor for 6 months at St. Augustine's. Then he becomes ill, is hospitalized. And as his health is failing, who is named Bishop of Cleveland? Richard Gilmore, his old friend from Cincinnati who he had skirmished with. So to this point, we don't know exactly what caused what, but at this point, O'Higgins returns to his native Ireland. His life had come full circle. So he lives with his sister in Mohill, County Leitrim, and he dies in November 1874 at just 45 years old. So all of this that transpired occurred in just 45 years. He had numerous assignments as a priest, missionary, pastor, seminary professor, army chaplain. His letters and the frequency of his moving around indicates that he was hard to get along with. He was distrustful of authority and could be jealous and even mean-spirited. His longest tenure of service, though, was found as chaplain, suggesting that this is where he felt most at home. Accounts of his chaplaincy reveal the difficulties of ministering to an ethnic regiment, which could be unruly and irreligious, serving alongside other priests with varying motives and intentions, and under generals and officers who tended to be supportive of his work. His service bears witness to the multifaceted role of the priest chaplain during the war, the zeal with which he ministered the sacraments, and ultimately the very deep concern that he had for his wartime flock. For O'Higgins and the men of the 10th Ohio, the war was a pathway towards greater acceptance. The Irish returned from the war to much fanfare. Though anti-Irish and anti-Catholic animus did remain to a degree, the Irish found the crucible of war as a way to prove their loyalty and gain greater acceptance. Many achieved what O'Higgins himself always longed for, a form of redemption, a form of acceptance and redemption as Irishmen, as Catholics, and now as Americans. Thank you.